Okay, if you look in Genesis chapter 16, we're going to pick up today the study in verse 6. Genesis 16, verse 6, but let's start with verse 1. You know, Abram and Sarai were just folks like us. And like them, we have our highs and our lows spiritually. There are times when we were pretty much on top of our game in the spiritual life, and sometimes not so much. What we're going to see in this whole chapter of chapter 16 is it all has to do with trusting the Lord. So this would be a good time for you to finish my sentence in unison. Are you ready? When it comes to problems in life, trusting is important. All right. Yeah, I see we don't even have to do it again. You did it so well the first time. That's one thing as to do it in an exercise. It's quite another when the rug has been pulled out from under you and you can't think of anything. You try to get rid of the fear and that you're consumed by it. That's when it's important to remember that trusting is more important than doing. You don't have to do anything. It's not incumbent upon you to figure it out. That's God's area. And what our job is just simply trust. Go to Him in prayer, pour out your soul, whatever the issue may be, and then trust Him to handle it. Even if there isn't a white dove that comes down as a sign. You don't need a sign. All you need to do is trust. And that's what this whole chapter 16 is about, is what happens when people are tired of waiting on the Lord to fulfill His promise, and they take matters into their own hands, and you can imagine it is a disaster. So we'll start with Genesis chapter 16, verse 1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. It's all the Lord's fault. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting, and now I am hacked off. I'm going to take matters into my own hands because the Lord is not faithful." I'm reading between the lines, but it's very clear if you are paying attention. "Please go to my maid." In other words, other translation says, "Go and have sexual intercourse with my servant. Perhaps I shall obtain children through her." And Abram listened to the voice of his wife. Do you have that underlined? If you don't, this would be a good time to do it. That is a disaster. It turns upside down the structure of marriage and the way that God would have us operate in it. Verse 3. "And after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife." I want you to underline that word wife because I'll mention it again in a moment. So she's going to make sure this is going to happen. She's going to make it happen. Verse 4. "And he went in to Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight." She thought she was better than her mistress now, and she was just making Sarai jealous because she was strutting about, acting as if she was better than the one that had authority over her. Verse 5. "And Sarai said to Abram, 'May the wrong done to me be upon you.'" This is nearly unbelievable. She has orchestrated this whole thing from the beginning to the end, taken this woman and put her hand in Abram, her husband's hand, and it all blows up in her face, and now it's all her husband's fault. And husbands, don't be looking at your wives. "I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. Now, what's so fascinating about this is even though Sarai is the one that had this planned and carried out this whole horrible scenario, she thinks she's the victim. And everybody in this story is wrong. No one is doing what's right. No one is trusting the Lord. And so she's so sure that she's the victim, she'll say, let God judge between you and me who's wrong. That's how certain and dogmatic someone can be when they are absolutely wrong, but they are blinded by arrogance. Now we pick up Genesis 16:6, which is where we'll begin today. But Abram said to Sarai, Behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarai treated her harshly, no surprise there, and she fled from her presence. This is so horrible when a husband does not take on the responsibility that God has delegated to him. Nowhere does God ever give the husband the right to take his responsibility and put it on anyone else, especially not the wife. This is a ghastly sin that, unfortunately, so many marriages are operating in this same fashion where the husband is not asserting his authority in order to fulfill his responsibility in being the head and the leader of the house, of his family. Someone that I'm very close to once told me that someone asked him one time, why do I never hear you complain about your family and your wife and things such as that? And he just smiled and said, well, that's because complaints go up, they don't go down. They go up the chain of command, not down from the top. And the reason, of course, is because the one in charge, if there's something that is awry, something that is not right in the family, his job is to make it right, not to complain to their subordinates, because their job is to submit to his authority, not to make things right. They make suggestions and so forth. So that's something to remember, husbands and fathers. God holds you responsible for the well-being and the welfare of your family. If there is chaos there, what Abram would do would be complaining. Oh, my wife is horrible. She bosses me around. I'm afraid of her. Of course, he probably didn't say that, but that was what was the truth. And so he did not take responsibility and change the way his household was functioning, and it always ends in chaos. The wife was not designed to carry the responsibility of the leadership of the house, and if she does take over that position, she is going to resent her husband. She will lose any respect for him because he is not fulfilling the role that God has assigned to him. And I know it's hard sometimes for wives to submit to their husbands because he's not always right, but he's always in charge because God made him and designed him to take on that responsibility. And it's as absurd for the husband to try to push his responsibility over on the wife as it is for parents to take their responsibility and try to put it off on their children. That would be a disaster as well. And the same thing goes in government. We have 3 branches of government. Each branch is responsible for the authority, the welfare that the Constitution delegates to them. And whenever they don't uphold that responsibility and try to put it off on one of the other branches, then you wind up with chaos, and that's what we're seeing today. I think the approval rating of Congress is in the single digits. pretty close. One reason is because they worship at the shrine of getting reelected rather than standing for God, for the Constitution, and upholding their responsibility. And one reason that our courts are legislating from the bench is because the Congress has made it so easy for them to do so and have given the approval of it, essentially. So this thing of taking responsibility that God has appointed to you is a very serious matter. And every time that husbands, even in a small way, advocate their responsibility, it always hurts the family. Even when the children come to the father and say, Daddy, can I go to the dance? I don't know, go ask your mother. That seems harmless enough, but it's a disaster. Like I said last Sunday, it won't be long before they don't even go to the father anymore. They go to the one that they see in charge, which is the mother. So there's a lot in this, and what makes it worse here is when Abram said, Behold, your maid is in your power. In other words, I'm putting her directly under your authority. He did that knowing that Sarai was angry with Hagar, and Hagar had this coming because she was the one that was arrogant and haughty and defiant to her mistress, the one that had authority over her. So neither one of them was doing what is right, but it doesn't excuse the fact that both of them were doing wrong. And out of all this, Abram when he said, she's under your power, what did he think was going to happen? Did he think that Sarai was going to be fair? Of course not, but it didn't matter to him. He just didn't want to handle the situation. And so what happens, of course, is that Sarai mistreated Hagar, made her life miserable to the point to where she ran away. She fled. And so do you see how everyone in this scenario has been wrong? Here's a principle for you. There's always calamity when the husband fails to assert his authority and accept the responsibility of being in charge. Now, the wife's responsibility is to support her husband, recognize his authority. Hopefully he's not a stubborn ogre, and she is able to make suggestions and try to support him the best she can. But her job is not to take over when she doesn't agree with his decisions. Her job is not to undermine his authority or make life miserable for him if she doesn't get her way. Actually, all that was somewhat of a review. This is where the lesson starts today. God never gave any husband the right to turn over authority to his wife except maybe for health reasons. If a husband can no longer function, especially if he's mentally unable to do so, then at that point the wife can legitimately take over the helm of the family. But even then, she doesn't do so in order to get her way. She does it because she's responsible for her children and, in this case, even her husband. Everyone suffers because of Abram's inaction. And we live in a society today that presents husbands as buffoons. Children talking to their father in a condescending way, and people approve of it. There are legions of women in our country that think we don't even need men around. That you can adopt, or you can have a surrogate mother and have children. You don't even need a father around. And how many families are minus the father? And how many families have the father, but they don't act like a father? All you have to do is look at the horrible condition of our country, especially our society, And you don't have to wonder why we're in such a mess. Fathers and husbands are not doing their job. Women aren't doing theirs. Husbands are to love their wives, take the responsibility that God has given them, and wives are to submit to their husbands and respect that decision. Abram certainly wasn't fair to Hagar. He should have protected her. In fact, when she started disrespecting Sarai, Abram should have stepped in and gone over there and nipped that in the bud. Just like Barney Fife. When things start getting out of kilter, you don't wait till it's a disaster. Men, you step in and nip it in the bud. As Barney Fife would say, nip it, nip it. He called Hagar Sarah's servant in verse 1. This is before she became his wife. But she wasn't a wife on the same plane as Sarai. But he called her servant in verse 1 rather than his wife as she had become in verse 3. Remember I told you underline wife? She was no longer a servant in the sense she was in verse 1. Now she was his wife and should have had more respect, and yet this is a giveaway when he called her a servant here in verse 16. That's because he didn't care for her. He cared more about being a wimp and not shouldering the responsibility than he did taking care of the trouble in his family. He knew that Sarai was angry with Hagar and was mistreating her, making her life miserable. And yet he gave total power, total authority over her to Sarai. And what happens then? What was bad turned to worse. It's always the situation when husbands fail to do their job. I want you to turn to Proverbs chapter 30, verse 21. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 21. Proverbs 30, 21. Under 3 things the earth quakes, and under 4 it cannot bear up. Verse 22. Here are the 4 things. First one, under a slave when he becomes king. Now, why is that a disaster? Why does the earth quake? It's because a slave doesn't know anything about being a leader. He's been a follower his entire life. He gets into a position of authority and he doesn't know how to act, and it's a disaster. Everyone suffers. And a fool when he is satisfied with food. This again would be a person who is in authority. And whenever he is satisfied, and you have this may be a metaphor, but to some degree it means it could be literal. Whenever he's full and satisfied, he doesn't care about anyone else. He only cares about himself, fulfilling his needs and being satisfied himself. He doesn't care about other people. That's when a fool is in a position of authority. Verse 23. Under an unloved woman when she gets a husband. The time that this was written, women for the most part did not choose their husband. Their husbands were chosen for them by their fathers. Hopefully, if you were a daughter at that time and you really loved some guy and you just really connected with this person, that you could persuade your father to give your hand to him. Many times it was done for economic reasons, political reasons, and so forth. So when a woman received a husband and she was unloved, there's hell to pay. She's angry, she's going to lash out. In this verse, in these verses here, the earth quakes when that happens. And then the last one, the fourth one here, is, and when a maidservant, when she supplants her mistress, when she goes against her mistress, when she no longer recognizes that she should be subordinate to her mistress, then the earth quakes again because there's hell to pay. So I hated Hagar because of the arrogant way she treated Sarai herself. Her hate and jealousy of Hagar caused her to seek revenge. That was what was on her radar, revenge for Hagar disrespecting her. Her hate and jealousy of Hagar caused her to seek revenge. Instead of trusting her husband Abram, or trusting God to deal with Hagar's arrogance, Sarai took matters into her own hands. How often do you think that is going to happen today? Not a mistress, but when someone doesn't like the way things are going, when wives don't go to their husbands and say, we've got a problem here, this is what's taking place, I'm telling you so that you can handle it. How many wives don't do that from the get-go and they take matters into their own hands? And how many times does the wife go to their husband and say that, and they pull a Abram and say, well, do whatever you think is best. The responsibility is on you on this. Giving her permission, the way the text, you can do anything you want to do. It's not on me. How many times does that happen? How many times is that going to happen today? In this country? Hopefully not in this church. So arrogance of Hagar blossomed into arrogance of Sarai, blossomed into the abdication of a husband's responsibility, and things really go south then, to the point to where Hagar is going to run away. Who's to blame? Hagar is to blame. Sarai is to blame. And most importantly, Abram is to blame. He could have nipped it in the bud. He could have kept this from happening. But he was not trusting the Lord. One other thing I want to say at this point is when Sarai did this, she had the notion that, or she may have had the notion that if I turn it over to my husband, then he might not handle it the way I want it to be handled. He might be too easy on her, and I want to make her pay. That could be a mindset there. Also, Sarai certainly had this in mind, that she thought she had control of the situation. And many times, rather than trusting God and pouring out our soul to Him and then wait for Him to do what is perfect and right at the right time, we think, well, I'll just take control. It's moving too slowly. How much control do you really have? We really don't control much, do we? We can't even control ourselves. And yet we're going about trying to control other people. This is a quote from George Van Pelt, Bibliotheca Sacra, Article 163. And this is what he says. Genesis 16, 1 through 6 shows that Sarai and Abram sought to accomplish what they wanted without trusting God. That's his opening statement. Can we identify with that? When was the last time you failed to trust the Lord and took matters into your own hands? I don't know, of course, that's a rhetorical question. I didn't say, did you ever do this? I said, when was the last time you did it? Because we all do it. It's a great temptation. Then he goes on to say, using methods of their own devising, because they did not wait on the Lord, the result, as seen so often in Genesis, was suffering as well as a failure to achieve the desired goal. Wenham calls this the wreck of human relationships. Anytime you're operating out of the role that God has designed for you, it is calamitous. It is a train wreck. Even though you think you're justified in doing it, because after all, God still hadn't acted. He still hadn't taken care of this. You give yourself permission to start doing instead of trusting. That's what we see here. So it was a failure to achieve their desired goal, and it always wrecks human relationships. Sarai was angry with God, angry with Abram, and angry with Hagar, and most of the discord was a result of her own doing. And yet she saw herself as the victim. She told her husband, the wrong done me is your fault. How can somebody be so blind? And when we say that, we should be looking in the mirror. This well illustrates, I'm still quoting here, this well illustrates the idea later stated succinctly in Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12. Proverbs 14:12 says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Sarai was so dogmatically certain she had it all figured out, and her scheme was going to play out, and it was going to be wonderful. She'd get what she wanted. It didn't happen, and it never does whenever you take control away from God. You don't take control away from Him. He allows you to do it, but it always ends in disaster. Now verse 7 through 9. Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going? And she said, I'm fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. We're going to take this piece by piece, starting with the angel of the Lord. This is the first time in Scripture that this term is used, and it's used often in the Old Testament. This is the first time. William Smith, in his Bible dictionary, says this, the special form in which God manifested Himself to man. He's talking about the term angel of the Lord. Is a special form in which God manifested Himself to man, and hence Christ's visible form before the incarnation. It's separate from a theophany. The Lord in the pillar of a fire and at night and the cloud by day when they were the Exodus, they were leaving, are called theophanies. This is the angel of the Lord. The angel of the Lord, I'll give you a couple of scriptures to help you get a handle on this. In Exodus chapter 3, verse 2 through 4. Exodus chapter 3, verse 2 through 4. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him, this would be Moses, in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the brush and said, Moses, Moses, I am. And he said, Moses, Moses. And Moses says, here I am. That was the angel of the Lord, which was none other than the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. Here's another verse. Well, let me go here. In Genesis 16:13, Hagar said this about the angel of the Lord. Quote, "You are the God who sees." The God who sees. And of course, we're not there yet, but I'm just commenting on the angel of the Lord, pre-incarnate Christ. I'm going to give you, let's see how many points I have here. 8, 9. I have 9 points on what we see here in verse 7. And what the topic, what we're looking at, is that, let me read verse 7 again because I read 7 through 9. Now the angel of the Lord found her, Hagar, by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. That verse, I think it's 9 points. And here's why I have 9 points, because this is the topic. This is what this verse is all about. And it's about the Lord seeks unbelievers and carnal believers. The Lord seeks unbelievers and believers. So those who are not trusting in the Lord, whether they're an unbeliever or a believer, God seeks them when they're not seeking Him. And we call that grace. Point number 1. Hagar did not seek the Lord. He sought her. When she was in this horrible situation where she was being maligned and her mistress was making life hell on earth, instead of going to the Lord, she just fled. And the Lord said, well, she's not trusting me. She's going to get what she deserves. Was that his attitude? No. He sought her. Point number 2. What did God do when Adam and Eve hid themselves after they sinned? Remember when they sinned and they saw that they were naked? They ran and got into the fig tree and tried to make some kind of clothes out of fig leaves. What happened? God sought them. It's interesting what he said when God sought Adam, he said, Adam, where are you? Now, of course, this isn't hide and seek. God's omniscient. He knew exactly where Adam was, but he was saying, okay, you disobeyed me. Where are you now, Adam? How do you like that? I added that last part, by the way. That's what I would have said. When Elijah fled because of Jezebel's threat on his life, the Lord sought after him. He went to a cave and Elijah said, I'm just sick of it all. Just go ahead and kill me. I want to die. I'm the only one standing up for anybody. I'm tired of it. Just kill me. That was his attitude. But our gracious, phenomenal Lord sought after him. Point number 4. The Lord helped Hagar even though she was not an heir to the promise that he made to Abram. This isn't a covenant thing. This is a love and gracious thing. Didn't depend on whether she was an Israelite, whether she was Jewish, or whether she was Gentile. This is the nature of God, to seek out those who are not seeking him. Number 5. Excuse me. The Lord helped her even though he had not made any promises to her. So how much more will he help those who he has made promises to? This is an a fortiori text here. A fortiori is Latin meaning with greater reason. So if he's going to help someone who did not ask for him is not under a covenant. The promise was not relating to her, and she was not seeking him. If he's going to go and seek her and take care of her, what will he do to those who are in a covenant with him and those who are his children? Number 6, the fact that she was near the spring on the way to Shur indicates that she was on her way back to Egypt. She was Egyptian. Of course, that's where she was headed. She was going to go home away from these horrible people, these people whose God was Yahweh. They sure weren't acting like it. So we know that she was going back to Egypt. Okay, I'm going to wait for y'all to finish your writing there, because I want you're really going to have to concentrate on this point to get it. And I'm not complaining that you're writing, that's fine. I just want to make sure I have your attention. Okay, this is point number 7. What comes to your mind when you consider the facts that came into play here? I'm going to give you some facts, and I want you to think, where does your mind go? What do you think? Here are the facts. Egypt. She was going to Egypt. She was an Egyptian. Slaves. She was a servant. She was a slave. Oppression. She was being oppressed by Sarai. Fleeing to the wilderness. The angel of the Lord. And water. What comes to your mind when you think of all those facts? The Exodus, right? They left Egypt. They were slaves. They were being oppressed. They fled to the wilderness. The angel of the Lord engaged them, and there was water. And sometimes there wasn't water. Not only was having water a problem because it was bitter water, they couldn't drink it, and then there was no water. And so all this is typifying that Egypt is always the place in the Old Testament scriptures, I won't say always, but usually the place where people want to go when they're not trusting the Lord. You remember in the Exodus, every time there was a disaster, and there was a lot of them, every time, what did they want to do? They wanted to kill Moses and Aaron and go back to Egypt. So Egypt really is a type of not trusting the Lord. Of course, if they would have went back to Egypt, Egypt couldn't even supply their needs, because after God got through with Egypt, you don't hear from them for another 300 or 500 years, because they are barely surviving themselves. How are they going to take all these slaves back? So just remember that. When you're not trusting God, you're headed back to Egypt, as if that's better. Number 8. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 10 through 20, Abram went to Egypt because of a famine. No water. Without even consulting the Lord. This is an example. Remember, there was a famine, and Abram just said, "Come on, family, we're headed to Egypt." He didn't even ask the Lord. If he would have asked, he's, "Lord, we have a famine. There's no water. Do you want me to stay here?" If he would have done that, the Lord might have said, "Yeah, you stay there, because I'm going to show my glory and my power to everybody, how you are the only one that can survive this famine because you've trusted me." Wouldn't that be great that is what we read? No. Instead, Abram goes to Egypt and he starts lying. He puts his wife in danger because he's being a coward. He says, "This is my sister, it's not my wife." And the Pharaoh had more character and integrity than he did. So he went back to Egypt, and going back to Egypt always is a disaster, because the reason people want to go back to Egypt is because they're not trusting the Lord. Point number 9. Believers are tempted to be impatient, turning to other sources that appear to supply a solution to their problem immediately. They can have it now, rather than waiting on the Lord to provide for them. I'm going to read that again because this touches all of us. Believers are tempted to be impatient, turning to other sources that appear like they're going to supply a solution to the problem, and they're going to do it now, rather than waiting on the Lord to provide for them. We've all been there. We've all done that. We all wanted to take a interstate highway back to Egypt. Get there as fast as we can. And we're never happy when we do so. I'm going to give you three issues or three examples, areas of examples where this takes place so we can relate to it better. Marriage is one of them. Many times there have been women who wanted out of their house. They had a dysfunctional family, and anything would be, they take any avenue to get out of the family. They didn't wait on the Lord to take care of them. In the midst of that, they're just going to, it's a self-made solution. And they took it, and they can end the misery of being in a family that is dysfunctional. And so they get married because they're not waiting on the Lord. And so now they go from a dysfunctional family to another dysfunctional family. Because that marriage isn't going to work. She wasn't trusting the Lord to begin with. And she's got married for the wrong reason. That's one way that happens in marriage, that a person could not, and that's not just for women, that's for men as well. Maybe it's a male and he's in a family and it's total dysfunction and he wants to get out of it, and so he chooses to get married thinking that's going to bring him happiness, but he's not trusting the Lord and never does. So that's a big decision, and you have to wait on the Lord. And when you wait on the Lord to get married, and you have the right reason to get married, it's not out of some way that's going to make your life easier, supposedly, and you know the person, you have gone through them with thick and thin, there's been enough time to where you can trust this person. When you do that, then you're going to be blessed because you waited on the Lord. You're not going to marry somebody that's an unbeliever. You shouldn't be marrying someone that's a believer but is negative towards doctrine. Why would you do that? Oh, well, I'm going to convert them. I'm going to make them be on fire from the Lord. Balderdash. What's going to happen, they're going to lead you down the trail of reversionism themselves. The second one would be a job or a career. People are different. When I left high school, I had to make a decision whether I was going to go to college or not. I didn't want to go to college. I wanted to get out in the world and start living. I had several scholarship offers, so I took one just because I didn't want to regret not at least trying it. But I would say probably most teenagers, usually they're teenagers when they leave high school, they don't really know what they want to do. But they can try to get ahead of God because they are afraid that they're not going to be successful. Their friends are getting jobs and they're getting into either after college or even after high school, wherever it is. There's always the issue, okay, I have to support myself. What am I going to do for a job? What should you do? You should go to the Lord and tell Him, I don't know what to do. I'm doing my best here, but I'm faltering. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to trust you to open a door so that I can walk through it. I'm not going to try to push a door open that's closed. That's how this relates to a job. And sometimes you may have to wait. That doesn't mean that you don't work until you find the job that God has opened the door for you. But you understand it's temporary. You have to provide for yourself, but still, you're waiting for the Lord to open a door. And when He does, then you should be certain about it. as certain as you can be. The problem sometimes several doors are opening, and you don't know which door to go through. And so you weigh it out, you try to make the best decision, but if you are not making a decision based on your trust in the Lord because you have asked Him to help you discern this. This is a minefield. I don't know what to do. If you haven't done that, then you're going to regret it because the Lord will answer your prayers on that. And the last one is family issues. I doubt that there's a family that's ever been that didn't have issues. And this applies to families' issues as well. Because usually there's one part of the family or one person in the family, and they're the stinker. There's always someone that's going to... I'm thinking of so many metaphors I can't use right now. So I'm kind of behind the 8 ball. So I won't use any. What we want to do is, rather than go to the Lord and ask Him to help open this person or persons, maybe more than one, eyes to what is really important and that they'll do the right thing, rather than doing that, you're going to force them. You're going to try to push the rope. You can't do it. And so you start pressuring people and not dealing with them where they are, but where you think they ought to be. And so you're going to take charge and you're going to make this happen. And you're not just relaxing, putting it in the Lord's hands and waiting. So I'm trying to give you some examples how we're tempted to be impatient, turning to other sources that appear to supply a solution to their problem immediately rather than waiting on the Lord to provide for them. And this is hard because sometimes it might be a family member, it might be a close friend, and they give you counsel, they give you their opinion on what you should do. And they mean well, they're trying to do the right thing, but many times it's the wrong opinion, it's the wrong solution. And we have to focus like a laser. I'm going to wait on the Lord, I'm going to turn it over to Him, I don't know what to do, I'm going to tell Him I don't know what to do, and give me peace and the ability to relax and continue to trust you and wait. That's not attractive to most people. Most people, I'm not going to wait. The problem's right here. I'm facing it. I've got to do something. Yeah, the something that you need to do is quit conniving and scheming and think you have control over this and recognize you are totally, completely relying on the Lord because He's in control. He loves you, and He will furnish the solution in His time. Meanwhile, our job is to trust. Psalm 27:13 through 14 says, I would have despaired unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Yes, wait for the Lord. That's Psalm 27:13 and 14. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 29 through 31. He gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might He increases strength. Even the youth shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But those who wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. That is a promise. And that's Isaiah chapter 40, verse 29 through 31. I'm getting close to the end, but I'm going to press on. Verse 8. He said to Hagar, this is the angel of the Lord. He said to Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? So she's out of kilter. She didn't trust the Lord. She was making trouble for herself and misery because of her arrogance. And then she just fled. That's what we do a lot of times. It gets to be such a mess. I'm just going to leave. I'm going to run away. And so did the Lord go to her? He did seek her, and he found her. So when he found her, he said, give her a scolding? Did he say, boy, you have blown it. What a disaster you've made your life. And just really reamed her out. Did he do that? No. Notice he's asking questions. He's not saying anything. He's asking. Where have you come from and where are you going? So that makes her stop and pause for a moment and think, okay, I was here where I was, that's where I was, and now I'm going here. And make her think, well, was it that bad there that you're now in the wilderness? A woman with a child in the wilderness going back to Egypt? This is a similar question that the Lord asked Adam when he was hiding, remember? He asked Hagar, where have you come and where are you going? He asked Adam, Adam, where are you? In other words, where are you now? You disobeyed. How's it going for you? Another way of saying this, when people are out of line and their life is a disaster, or they say they don't believe the Bible, they don't believe in God, they don't do whatever. It's like saying, how's that working out for you? That's essentially what these questions invoke. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 9, then the Lord God called to the man and said to him, where are you? Note that the Lord said to Elijah when he fled from Jezebel. This is what he said to Elijah. This is 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 8 through 9. So we had Genesis 3, 9, and we have the Lord asking Adam where he was. Now Elijah in 1 Kings 19, 8 through 9. So Elijah, rose and ate and drank and went in his strength of that food for 40 days. By the way, the food that he received was from the angel of the Lord too. He stopped and had to refresh. Now he can go 40 miles. He filled up his tank and he got 40 miles on that tank. And he went in the strength of that food for 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. Verse 9. Then he came there to the cave and lodged there, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Just think about it. That's a thought-provoking question, is it not? What are you doing in a cave 40 miles away? Well, the reason was because Jezebel said that before the sun set, she was going to have him killed. Now, he was a great illustration of trusting the Lord on Mount Carmel. Remember? He called the fire down, and he was on top of his game. But after a victory, many times we're at our weakest point because we think we got it. We think we're in control and we can handle it. And then when Jezebel launched her threat, it was just a threat. And he was undone. He's leaving. So that's what he's asking. Notice that the Lord did not fuss at them, nor did he preach to them. He simply asked them questions that helped them to see how foolish they were behaving. He didn't have to say anything. We need to remember that. When someone's made bad decisions and their life is in turmoil, you don't have to go and tell them that. They already know it. Well, the good thing to do is ask them, why are you here? Why are you at this place? Why is all this happening? Why are you miserable? You're not telling them, you're asking them. Most of the time, if they're honest, they're going to recognize, well, I'm certainly not trusting the Lord. I took over. And every time someone thinks they take control away from the Lord, it always ends in disaster. Not trusting the Lord. Well, I can't go on because I'm out of time. The next verse Verse 9, then the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. Ha! Boy, I bet that took the breath out of her. How many notes? I only have 2 notes on this one. I mean, 2 numbered notes. I have more notes than that. Anyway, so what do we take away from today of what we've been studying? First of all, trusting. That's what this life is really about. Over and over and over, year after year, month after month, day after day, we have opportunities to trust the Lord. How many of those days, months, and years have we blown by depending on self? And we were anxious. We were afraid. We were angry. It's just not fair. Life didn't treat me fair. It's so important. This is what this life is about, is learning to trust the Lord. And it's axiomatic when you're trusting the Lord that you're going to be relaxed because the burden's not on you. You gave it to Him. He promises that He will hear us. And He will act in His time and in His way. The thing that we have to do is what I dislike the most, is waiting. But do you know when you're really trusting Him, no matter what happens, it's not so hard. As long as you're thinking about Him and you're waiting for that phenomenal day that He's going to act, the perfect time in the perfect way. And we don't want to gum up the works by taking control ourselves. This last portion of our service today is towards those who haven't trusted the Lord. They have anxiety about what the future holds, especially when they die. They're trying to sublimate, put it out of their mind, but that day is rolling around. It'll be here. And all that anxiety and fear is not necessary, because Jesus Christ said, come unto me, all you who are weary, and I will give you rest. Rest from being upset and afraid and angry. My burden is light. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, went to the cross. He died on that cross. He was buried. Of course, the grave could not control Him. After 3 days, He rose again. And He promises eternal life to anyone who will trust Him for it, that will depend on His perfect work rather than their own works. And it only is given as a gift. You cannot work for it. That's the graciousness and love of our God. And you can make that decision today that you're going to trust the Lord Jesus Christ and His work on the cross rather than your own good deeds. And in that moment, you are born again. You become a royal family member of the Most High. Your ticket to heaven is guaranteed. And now you have the high honor to be a royal ambassador, to grow in grace and knowledge. Trust the Lord so that the world can see what He can do on your behalf. Now, Father, thank You for this portion of Scripture. Help it to sink deep into each one of us in our souls and in our thinking. Help us to apply the things that we've been looking at regarding marriage and relationships. But most of all, help us to trust You in all things. We lift our prayer in Christ's most high and holy name. Amen.